In 2020, when this massive digital shift started, our own Mastercard data showed that the number of businesses that went online tripled from pre-pandemic levels. E-commerce spending increased by almost $1 trillion during 2020. And it went from, in retail in particular, it went from $1 out of every $5 when it was 1 out of every 7 in 2019. But 2021 was the year where we were wondering how much of that would stick. And our early data on, at least on the small business e-commerce trend, is that at least 20 to 30% of that will stay. We are here, and it's such an interesting panel because we're going to touch on the question about how in this accelerated digital future, we need to make sure that we have both inclusion and resilience, right? And so we're going to talk about the effective governance of data, a better digital infrastructure, particularly around health and education, and for those who are underserved, and really ensuring that everyone, that parents, that workers, that teachers have the skills that they need to succeed in the digital economy.
And ASAR is a study that Pratham leads every year. And it is widely regarded as the gold standard for impact evaluation of education interventions anywhere in the world.
We've been doing ASAR, which is the Annual Status of Education Report, since 2005. This is a survey of learning and schooling done every year, and with a sample of about 600,000 children. You know, the pandemic had affected already disadvantaged and vulnerable groups far more, and it was possible that that was the case in education as well. So the survey was conducted in September of last year, and it focused basically on four areas: enrollment, support that children had in learning at home, and their access to learning materials which states and schools were sending, and their engagement with learning materials.
We have learned how to connect and how to remain connected with especially with low income, low educated parents on the issue of learning.
Robin, can you share a bit about the work that you've been doing on digital accelerators out of Africa and some of the developments there over the last couple of years?
I've spent the past, decade and a half focused on what was then not called digital transformation, but the construct of how digital technologies, both as an infrastructure as well as a source of innovation and a source of skills, et cetera, can unlock economic growth, and in particular, inclusive economic growth in the region. And we wanted to ask ourselves, building on the work that we've done, how can we move from early examples of what kinds of investments are needed to solutions that are sustainable and effective at a higher scale. And as you start to talk about the question of employment, one of the biggest challenges many governments are facing is they fundamentally don't know what skills are in their economies and or what jobs are in their economies and how to most effectively match. A second one I'll mention briefly we're quite interested in is looking at digital public infrastructure specifically for the purposes of accessing education. And the last one is different kinds of investment in connectivity, because as we've seen in COVID, one of the things that has become very clear was that the digital divide is still quite real from an access to connectivity perspective. At the same time, technology costs are going down, but for some reason, we're not moving as quickly to get people connected as I think most stakeholders argue we would like to see.
We turn to Oret Van Hunden and his team to try and understand how to gauge citizen response to a top-down crackdown, as it were, by governments.
So I immediately set up a team in China, including in Wuhan, and we started to track posts in the public domain, public posts on the most popular social media sites in China. And it gave us this incredible insight into the way people were experiencing the impact of this emerging pandemic. And you could use this tool, this sort of large-scale sentiment and emotional analysis at every stage in the policy cycle, from agenda setting through policy formulation, implementation, monitoring, and ultimately evaluation.
So Susan and Thomas, you've done an incredible study of data governance principles across 52 countries. Perhaps you can share some insights from your research.
The key takeaways we have is that we're not simply defining data governance as laws and regulations, but increasingly it includes visions and strategies, ethical and human rights consideration, how they change government. The structure of government is changing to accommodate data. If we are to summarize the metric, we see nations are doing more to regulate and adapt governance structures than to develop participatory, and this kind of builds on Auret's point, responsible and internationally shared approaches. And that is scary.
I'm wondering, David Porteous, as you listen to this discussion, you're in the process of envisioning how we can prepare a coming generation of digital leaders, whether they are in government or in companies or even in the social sector, as they think about the use of technology and the deployment of technology in inclusive ways.
I've also heard some very taking outtakes, clips, which can definitely be part of informing the thinking around this next generation of private sector innovators in developing countries and policymakers, whom we hope will be the targets of this Fletcher Digital Frontiers course due out next year.